Oh, okay. I want to welcome everybody. And is there some way I can not, I could be, get rid of the sound of these things? Or take me off that or something? Okay. Um, yes, anyway, so I'd like to welcome everybody to today's event. I'm delighted to be able to celebrate Natalia Romé's new book, and her first book written and published in the English language, For Theory, Althusser and the Politics of Time. Natalia is already very widely known throughout the Hispanophone world for her work on Althusser, which consists of a number of books, many articles, and also collections. In my view, Natalia is one of the most important scholars of Althusser and Althusserianism today in any language. Natalia is, I'll translate this into English, is a professor of social sciences at the University of Buenos Aires and the National University of La Plata. It is my hope that the publication of For Theory, her book, will, as Althusser like to say, faire bouger les choses, that is, shake things up and help open up our reading of Althusser, especially in our still very monolingual world of Anglophone academia that persists in reading Althusser in a very narrow way. We are joined by two distinguished speakers, in addition to myself, who will briefly discuss Natalia's book. The first speaker will be Vittorio Morfino from the University of Milan Bicocca, and Agon Hamza, who's the co-editor of Crisis and Critique, and Agon, correct me if I'm wrong, currently a fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanity in Skopje, Macedonia. Following these presentations, and I'll be saying something myself in a second, we will have responses by Natalia, and then a period for questions that we ask you to pose in the chat area. So, and we'll take the questions as they in order as they show up. Okay, so just a few brief remarks. If we can say that the project of decolonizing Marx began long before it was identified as such, before even the founding of the Second International, where the unresolved contradictions of the socialist movement on the question of the increasing number of European colonies were played out openly, we might say that the project of decolonizing Althusser is a project inscribed in Althusserianism from its origins. I use the term Althusserianism here, a term rejected by its participants, the supposed participants, to recall that Althusser, who often referred to the solitude of great thinkers from Machiavelli and Spinoza to Marx and Freud, also ventured to remind his critic, John Lewis, we know the response to John Lewis' text, that un communiste n'est jamais seul, a communist is never alone. In many ways that have yet to be understood, the young students who came to Althusser in 1961 to study Marx, it was first Balibar and Macheret, and soon others, had, I believe, without exception, been radicalized in the resistance to the Algerian War. And Althusser spoke about this later in his response in defense of the students in 1968, his response to a letter by Michel Verret. And although these students were members of the Communist Student Group, affiliated with the Communist Party, they nevertheless supported the FLN, the National Liberation Movement in Algeria, and their objective of total independence of Algeria, a position that the Communist Party rejected until the very end of the whole struggle. Soon after the seminars began, but even before students from Latin America, like Emilio de Ipola and Marta Harnecker, began attending Althusser seminars, he and his students saw the Cuban Revolution as the opening of a process in Latin America whose every detail was significant and worthy of study. And much of this can be found in the archives, and also even in Cahiers Marxiste-Leniniste. From this point on, that is from the early 60s, Althusser and his students remained concerned with the unfolding struggles in Latin America. And it was through this interest that Regis Debray, who was initially a member, maybe somewhat peripheral, of Althusser's circle, began to visit Cuba frequently. And between 62 and 1966, he taught periodically at the University of Havana. As many of you know, in 1967, he left Havana and joined Che Guevara's insurgency in Bolivia, where Debray was captured and imprisoned for a number of years, and there was an international campaign to free him, in which Althusser played a certain role. And in addition to this, Balibar, as well as others, taught numerous times in Cuba at the university during the 1960s. We have to be very clear, however, that these discussions, and these in particular, in these discussions, Althusser did not play the role of a leader whose job was to transmit the correct line to his students. In fact, as Althusser himself wrote to Franca Madonia, his students were constantly pushing him forward, quote unquote, kicking my ass, is what he says, when he hesitated politically, and forcing him to be far more critical of the PCF's positions on anti-colonial struggles than he might have been otherwise, especially in the case of Algeria, where, because of his family background, he might have been tempted to support the communist position. In politics, as well as in the realm of theory, therefore, Althusser would not have been Althusser without the collective endeavor or community of thought, as Macheret likes to call it, that shaped each of the participants in their singularity. Okay, all of this may be fine and well, but what does this have to do with our guest of honor, Natalia Romé? Okay. For Theory, the book, For Theory, if properly understood and appreciated, should serve as a reminder that the process of decolonizing theory, above all theoretical work devoted to continuing the Althusserian project, cannot simply repeat the concepts of this project or apply them as a method of interpretation, but must take as an unevenly developed and radically incomplete set of theses, must take it as a radically incomplete set of theses to be tested and corrected or rejected, a set that remains unfinished and may well be unfinishable. The very year 1976 that Perry Anderson, in his book on Western Marxism, condemned Althusser's work as part of a sort of depoliticized, overly intellectual Western Marxism, a kind of scholastic Marxism in the case of Althusser, concerned with theory irrespective of its relation to practice. This same year was a year that many of those who engaged in discussions about Althusser in Argentina, who didn't feel that Althusser was irrelevant to practical questions, were not living in a period of melancholic reflection, but were living through momentous struggles in which many were killed, tortured, or forced into exile, including those who later returned to Argentina to engage with a new generation of left intellectuals, including Natalia and many others. In fact, Natalia is at the center of a broad collective effort to continue to work on the problems and questions identified by Althusser, Balibar, Macheret, and others. And much of what is most rigorous, original, and comprehensive in the study of these philosophers today has been produced by Natalia and her colleagues. I can't name them. There are many of them, and all of them are doing very interesting work. I can't name all of them, so I don't want to name any of them. It is essential to translate and disseminate their work as widely as possible, and to make sure that we integrate our discussions into theirs. The appearance of For Theory, the book, could and should be the first step in such a process. Okay, just some brief remarks about the book. For a number of reasons, I want to say a few things about just the first chapter of Natalia's book, Against Theoretical Reformism. I laughed when I read the title for the first time, not because I thought it was strange, but precisely the opposite. It was the title, or close to the title, that I had always wanted to give to an essay or a book chapter, but lacked the courage to do so. I feared that applying the term reformism, as I often did in my political life, to the work of theory would inevitably provoke a negative reaction, or probably more likely provoke a reaction of utter incomprehension in a US audience. Natalia's gesture illustrates or performs in a very clear way the mutual immanence of theory and practice, including even at the strategic and tactical level, in a way that I would predict will be as disturbing for some readers as it is liberating for me. It raised the stakes of theoretical work and explained why Althusser would call the statement of philosophical theses interventions, a term that was usually used for practical political activity, and how he could speak of philosophy as class struggle on the terrain of theory, a notion that, formulated in this way, indeed proved unintelligible to many of his readers, especially in the English-speaking world. Who among his readers recognized that in certain ways he had simply rewritten Lenin's short pamphlet from 1917 on slogans, in which Lenin warned that because the meaning and effects of words change with the conjuncture, which can change very rapidly, and the conjuncture is a relationship of forces that is always in a precarious balance, slogans must be adjusted in response, in relation to this. And in philosophy, it is exactly the same case. Philosophy needs to adjust its theses, its statements, in response to what Althusser called the philosophical conjuncture, which is, of course, not independent of the broader conjuncture. But why did such a view of philosophy or theory prove so counterintuitive, or rather so contrary to what philosophy, quote, obviously is, or obviously does? And here, Natalia is one of the very few to note the importance of the notions of évidence and l'évident for Althusser, especially, not throughout his entire work, but especially in the context of the essay on the ideological state apparatuses. There he refers, there are nearly 20 occurrences of one of these words having to do with évidence. He talks about les évidences tenaces, tenacious, how we're going to translate to évidence, tenacious obviousnesses, to the kind of obviousness, very particular, that he's going to talk about later, in which it is said, yes, that's exactly how it is. That is absolutely true. Okay. But the remainder of the 15, the remaining 15 occurrences of one of these two terms are all concentrated in 2 paragraphs in the section Ideology Interpolates Individuals as Subjects. In order to understand these terms and their importance for Althusser, we have to clarify some of the ambiguities that accumulate around the English translations. Althusser's meaning, in my view, has been best captured by Ben Brewster, his first translator, who has rendered them as obvious and obviousness, in plural obviousnesses, rather than evident or evidence. Because in English, evident and evidence are weaker terms than they are in French. And we can think of the term évidemment in French, which has to be translated as obviously. It's like something that it's ridiculous not to know. And compare that to, compare obviously to evidently in English, which doesn't mean it's certainly, something is certainly the way it is, but there's even an element of doubt. The English obvious is also useful in certain ways. Maybe even it adds something to the French that is relevant to Althusser, because it comes from the Latin ob via, or in the way, as in something, an obstacle placed in our way, in our path, imposed on us, which is a phrase that Althusser uses. The obvious is imposed on us as obvious. And in Latin, it becomes a physical obstacle that we cannot avoid. And the physicality of the Latin, I think, is something that's useful to keep in mind. In particular, Althusser cites two, quote, primary obviousnesses, unquote. And here they are: that it is clear that you and I are subjects, free, ethical, etc. And like all obviousnesses, including those that make a word name a thing or have a meaning, therefore including the obviousness of the transparency of language, the obviousness that you and I are subjects, and that does not cause any problems or raise any doubt, is an ideological effect, the elementary ideological effect, unquote. That was all Althusser. Okay. In relation to this, Natalia correctly reminds us that Althusser neither explains how these obviousnesses are imposed on us, or how the individual as the obviously free subject is linked to language understood as naming and meaning. And this task, as she points out, was left to Michel Pecheux, whose work is much more widely read in Latin America than in the US, which is very unfortunate. And she will show us how useful his work can be. It was he who, beginning with Les Vérités de la Palisse, and in a number of later texts, tried to theorize the means by which certain obviousnesses were, as Althusser put it, imposed on us, that is, forced on us as certainties. Natalia lays out the ways in which Pecheux's emphasis on discourse as practice, not just as communication of meaning, as practice, above all, as ritual or even performance. And of course, he's referring to J.L. Austin's speech act theory, which initially Pecheux was very critical of, but over time, without exactly acknowledging it, he integrated parts of this theory into his own thinking. And his idea was ritual and performance expose even or especially the enunciation of the obvious to the risk of failure or deviation, to the production of those irreducible ambiguities we call puns, to homophony that can overpower synonymy and reveal the obvious as an imposition. It reveals the relations of force behind it. Okay. Now, just to conclude very, very briefly, this takes us back to the idea of the possibility of reformism in theory, a theoretical reformism, because we cannot separate theory from practice in the way that so many commentators have tried to do. and to accept the idea that theory is not the practice, let alone the only practice, but just a practice that has a material existence among other practices with their own materiality. And as Althusser said very, very eloquently, there are relations of force between ideas, power relations between not just ideas, but words, forms of discourse, etc. Okay, and this takes us back to the theme or the necessity of decolonization, because decolonization begins above all with a recognition that ideology is not made up of beliefs or consciousness or thoughts, but it has a material existence, and it is part of the struggle to change relations of power in society and globally as well. And Natalia's contribution in this realm is very, very important. And without understanding that, we're left sort of turning in the same circle of bad ideas. Okay, and I'll stop there, and we will go on to Vittorio Morfino. Right.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here and to present this book. I agree with Warren. It is a great title. I like very much it, and I want to say something general about, first of all, about the title, and then about the book, not entering in details. For theory, at the first glance, it seems a defense of the period of Althusser's production, in which Althusser wrote his two great masterpieces, Pour Marx and Lire le Capital, For Marx and Reading Capital. A defense of theory from the self-criticism of Althusser himself, announced in the note of the second edition of Reading Capital, and then developed in elements of self-criticism. But of course, there is another sense. It is a defense of theory itself. In Althusser theory, in this period, the theoreticism, it was a defense from all relativisms, historicism, and in this conjuncture, Natalia did a defense of theory from all the negation of theory, from relativism, from postmodernism, from the transformation of philosophy in literary criticism, or from depolitization of theory. It's needless to say that theory for Natalia means Marxism. So in some sense, it is a defense of Marxism. But what it seems to me very interesting in the book is that the defense of theory, the vindication of theory, is realized by Natalia through the use of the concept of set of concept of the Althusser of the self-criticism. Theory is an intervention in the conjuncture, in a conflictual conjuncture, as Warren has said. Philosophy is class struggle in the terrain of theory, to draw lines of demarcation. And this is some concept of Lenin and philosophy, and then from reply to John Lewis. So in this sense, as for Althusser in the 60s, the vindication of theories in Natalia's book has a deep political meaning. In Althusser was, as I said, against historicism, evolutionism, relativism, and historicism. There was a kind of legitimation of the line of the party. And so the theoricism of Althusser was a struggle in theory. In Natalia's book, theory is the vindication of theory is a vindication of against all philosophy of history of the end of Marxism and communism. Is a way to reopen history against a critical thought, against there are interesting intervention in the book, against a critical thought that is deprived of its Marxist basis. And so it becomes weak. But I would like to say that the author of this extraordinary book is more than a person, not a Superman, but a Superwoman. But I want to say that, of course, Natalia is an extraordinary philosopher, extremely brilliant, smart, and deep. But I think that this book is an expression, or better, a re-elaboration of a kind of intersection of histories. First of all, there is in Argentina a long tradition of interpretation of Althusser. We can quote Kars, Malamud, De Ipola, Aricò, but it is more important than that. Than what for example, in Italian can understand. I've discovered this important tradition in the Congress that Natalia and other comrades has organized. And then it is an expression and a re-elaboration. I don't want to fall in a spiritual expression, Leibnizian spiritual expression, of course, but it's an expression of an extraordinary group of work, a more little group, and then an enlarged group of the UBA, the Universidad de Buenos Aires. I see many friends and comrades here, and it's a great pleasure. And then is an expression, a elaboration of an enlarged group, the group of Latino America, la RELEA, la red de estudios latino, la red althusseriana de estudios latinoamericanos. So, and then Italian, United States, and other friends. But I want to say that this book is an extraordinary. I think is really extraordinary because is a restoration, very brilliant, of a tradition, of an extraordinary tradition, of an extraordinary work. And I want to quote only the principal instrument of this group, the journal Demarcaciones, that is very important for the discussion and for the elaboration, and the collective body of this group that are the conferences that every two years take place, as took place in Buenos Aires, Santiago, Campinas, and the next year in Buenos Aires again. We could perhaps say that we find the originality of the work of Natalia and at the intersection of these lines, without, of course, reducing the originality to this. But which is the main characteristic of this book? This is not an historical reconstruction of Althusser thought, not at all. Althusser thought is used by Natalia to intervene in the contemporary conjunction. Althusser thought kind of theoretical wisdom to intervene in our times. But what is Althusserian thought? Where we can find it? Althusser's thought, as we know, is not an intemporal essence in the mind of God. We can say proudly that we have a first reception of Althusser. I used the terms of Stefano Pippa in the 60s, and the second reception of Althusser after the publication of some unpublished texts in the 90s and in the first year of the new century. We can pose the question about the true Althusser, the structuralist Althusser, or the Althusser of aleatory materialism. In my opinion, the work of Natalia is clearly beyond this alternative. Before using Althusser thoughts in the Kampfplatz, the battlefield of contemporary philosophy, that is of contemporary ideology, she gave a systematic unity. Better, she built Althusser thought in the same way in which we can say that Althusser has built Marx thought. She built Althusser thought using concepts from every period of Althusser's production, from the masterpieces of the 60s and from some unpublished texts on psychoanalysis and on theater, from the courses of the 70s, of course, and the text on apparatuses. In particular, the fundamental courses on Machiavelli, and finally from the text on aleatory materialism. But not only. Natalia uses some developments in a creative way of the Althusserian problematic produced by, in particular, Michel Pecheux and Etienne Balibar. As I have said before, this book is not an historical reconstruction of Althusser thought, even if it sheds light on some fundamental passages of it. This book is a theoretical reconstruction of Althusser thought made with some materials offered by Althusser and his students, with some concepts which are interrelated in a systematic way in her thoughts. I'm very impressed when I read Natalia. I have the impression of a machine that is producing concepts. After Balibar, we used to say that there is a reciprocity between structure and conjuncture in Althusser thought. What does it mean? Thinking together, overdetermination, plural temporality, reproduction, ideology as materialism of imaginary, theories of discourse, the theory of trans-individual. She shows us of which substance a structure is made. Every structure is made, rendering intelligible this reciprocity, this concept of reciprocity. Every structure is made of practices, relations, time strata, relation of forces not given once for all, but variable. And every conjuncture has a profundity, a structuration, and must not be thought as something superficial, something like an instant in a timeline, continuous or discontinuous. In this sense, and it's an idea, we can perhaps say that the most important contribution of Natalia's book For Theory is precisely the complex and systematic definition of the concept of conjuncture for us in an Althusserian way.
Agon, it's your turn. Vittorio, are you finished? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Agon.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me in this event. I'm writing this paper in the aftermath of an electoral campaign in which I was actively involved. The first spontaneous association is with a letter of Althusser written on the 2nd of April 1968 to Maria Antonietta Maciocchi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's too long of a surname. An Italian communist militant who at the time was running for an MP. In this letter, Althusser writes, I'm quoting, "Politics is a protracted war. Do not be in a hurry. Try to see things far in advance and know how to wait today. Don't live in terms of subjective urgency. Know too how to put your defeats to use." The end of quote. Although I was not running in this election, this definition or advice is of extreme importance. Elections are essentially an anti-philosophical enterprise in the sense that they are nominally, at least, a democratic procedure. Philosophy, I believe, stands as the ultimate anti-democratic discipline, be it in an ancient socialist or whatever forms it may take. The object of elections is supposed to be politics and things political. In a sense, in all its paradoxes, Althusser is a very fine companion to philosophically think the political effects of elections. And Natalia's Althusser is even a finer interlocutor for this task. An electoral campaign, Althusser writes, is the first step towards answering the basic but essential question: what is happening among the people? And simultaneously, what does the people mean today in a given country? Natalia sets out to work or articulate the problem of articulation of political practice and theoretical practice. The end of quote. This is the name of theoreticism. She writes that the question of political practice and theoretical practice is enacted by the figure of Marxist dialectic, the category of overdetermination, which is present in Althusser's theoreticist period, in which he defines philosophy as the theory of theoretical practice. She is very right to argue that, I'm quoting Natalia, Althusserian problematic consists of dealing with a disjointed union of the theoretical and the political. Althusser turns this aporetic solution into the materialist formula for the problem that Marxist discovery puts in tension. The impossible encounter of philosophy and history is reinscribed as a contradictory union between theory and politics. The end of quote. The question of theory and practice is the crux of the matter. Natalia takes a very daring step in her book when she attempts to rehabilitate Althusser's definition of philosophy as theory of theoretical practice. This is a daring step to take not only because Althusser distanced himself from this formulation of philosophy, but also because it was corrected with a completely different thesis about which I will talk later. However, what Natalia does here is very interesting for the reason that her book is not merely a simple defense of Althusser. After all, every engagement in defending a certain philosopher always falls short because there is no better defense of a thinker than his or her own work. What is the problem of defining philosophy as theory of theoretical practice? This conceptualization of philosophy was a result of Althusser's attempt to reconstruct as well as extract the scientific nature or historical materialism. For Natalia, the return to theoreticism or for theory is not simply the defense of theory in a period which is hostile to any form of theoretization of the world as it is or as it ought to be, if you are to make an utterly anti-Hegelian move. I, for my part, can attest that the elections, no matter how relevant or important they may be within a certain conjuncture, or perhaps the ultimate anti-political political act. And I would say that they occupy an anti-theoretical position. To paraphrase Althusser from the same correspondence, in the elections, one should always beware of electoral cretinism and cretinism of an electoral campaign. Natalia is not very much preoccupied with proving that theory is still alive, or that theory is as important as ever before, although it is under attack from all sides. Her concern is to work out or show the specificities of theory in its relation to practice and politics. To those who proclaim the primacy of practice over theory, Natalia replies by saying that there is no outside of theory, even in the anti-theoretical positions. The defense of anti-theoretical position is carried out by the means of theory. She moves beyond this dichotomy, so to speak, by affirming the position that theory is in itself conceived as an existing practice. By doing so, she moves beyond the common understanding of theory as opposed to, say, philosophy as a procedure of conceptual thinking. There is no theory that doesn't have a material existence, that is, without its practical dimension or a practical element. As said, Althusser proposed this definition of philosophy when he was concerned with restoring the scientific nature of historical materialism. This is the period when he was engaged with epistemology, or more precisely with an epistemological reading of Marx's work. Consequently, Althusser defines theory as a theory of theoretical practice. His second definition of philosophy is as follows. Philosophy is, in the last instance, class struggle in the field of theory. This definition is too condensed, as he himself admits, in different texts, amongst other places, in a reply to John Lewis. Philosophy stands in the field of theory in a specific relation with sciences. However, it is distinct from sciences, which, unlike philosophy, have an object of study. Unlike sciences, philosophy stands in an intimate relation with class tendency of ideologies, which in the last instance are practical, in the last instance. Thus, philosophy is not a class struggle in theory, but is such only in the last instance. The function of philosophy, which operates through stating propositions in the form of theses, is to draw lines of demarcation, not only from within philosophy itself, let's say between idealism versus materialism, but also with other procedures that condition, to flirt with Badiou's terminology, philosophy as such. A philosophical thesis is never a passive thesis, which is a mere transmission of knowledge of a facts of a situation, etc. A philosophical thesis is always active insofar as it produces effects in the theoretical, that is, philosophical and political realms. Or, as Althusser put it later on, philosophy does not produce knowledge of a real object, but posits theses which state the existence of a philosophical object or properties of that object. The end of quote. Stating a thesis is less of an epistemological act than a conflictual move in the field in which it is stated, insofar as philosophy is always already characterized by its opposite tendency. That is, a philosophical thesis consists not only of drawing lines of demarcation with the opposite tendency, but also of occupying ground previously held by a philosophical adversary. For example, every materialism contains in itself idealist philosophy and vice versa. In fact, every philosophical proposition creates in itself the very conflict it tries to resolve. For this reason, what in every philosophy is realized is not only a tendency, but the antagonistic contradiction between two tendencies. Althusser notes that philosophy exists in those situations in which social classes and sciences exist simultaneously. In other words, philosophy is strictly conditioned by the existence of class struggle carried out in a political domain and scientific discoveries. In a nutshell, there can be said to be two primary functions of philosophy and conceived by Althusser. Philosophy intervenes precisely not in everyday life, but rather with regard to the determination in the last instance, a concept he borrows from Freud and applies to historical materialism, according to which the totality is a complex whole without clear causal relations. And since it has an intervening character, it maintains an authoritarian relation with regard to its non-philosophical conditions. To conclude, the greatness of Natalia's book is not only her ability to confront with Enrico Stark the most problematic thesis and the period of Althusser's work. All this she does while performing a symptomatic reading to Althusser himself. Her defense and rehabilitation of theory, not as an activity for foreshadowings of the future, as Marx writes in the Grundrisse, but as a theory of transformative capability. In this sense, I am inclined to think, together with Natalia, of an almost absurd inactivity. I'm reminded of an iconical remark in the novel, The Winter of the Great Solitude, by the Albanian novelist Ismail Kadei. I don't think, or I don't know whether it was translated into English or any other big language. While ridiculing the Euro-communism, okay, this was written in the period while he was still a communist before his deterioration. While ridiculing the Euro-communist strategies of reformism, the main character of the novel, Beni, says to his close friend, I quote, "Now it seems to be different. Word is that socialism may win the elections." To which his friend replies, "It is really tasteless. You raise your hand and then count the votes. Who is in favor, who is against, socialism won." To this claim, Beni replies, "It is better that you say that capitalism will stand up and engage in self-criticism. Dear socialism, I made a few mistakes, like exploiting the working class, etc. For this reason, I let you handle the things from now on." Together with Rome's book, I believe we can think about what is quite important in our situation, especially with regard to politics. Why are the elections necessary? And I think the quote above can bring some light to it. Or put differently, why are they probably the only legitimate means of engaging in and with politics? At least that's what the ruling ideology tells us. One cannot think of a revolution anymore. In fact, it is practically impossible to know what does it mean to be a revolutionary in the 21st century. For this reason, we have to reinvent politics from its revolutionary and violent dimensions, terror, all the way down to technocracies, which should be at the service of politics. And to really conclude, in what constitutes the Althusserian field today, I believe Natalia's book is a crucial intervention. And I'm not only talking about the Argentinian or Latin American reception of Althusser, which, as Vittorio said, are very, very, very rich. To the question whether it is possible or not to be an Althusserian today, Natalia powerfully and convincingly proves that being an Althusserian is in fact a necessity. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Natalia, it's your turn. Go right ahead.
Hey, Warren, Vittorio, Agon, thank you so much for your generous readings and beautiful words. And I want to thank each one of you for joining us today for this presentation full of friends and colleagues. You know that a Latin American woman, daughter of a generation of defeated utopia and exile, formed in a university, in a public university impoverished by neoliberal policies, can publish a book of theory that does not bear the title Latin American Studies or Althusser in Latin America or something like that, can only have happened by the strength and affection of a collective body. Many of those who are here today are fundamental parts of that trans-individual body. My friends of teaching and research in Buenos Aires University, the comrades of debates, conversations, and militancy, the beautiful group of Althusserian from Latin America that Vittorio and Warren mentioned, from Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and adjacent areas such as Spain, Italy, United States, and France, but also great masters and teachers. Warren has pointed out also. I must mention here my dear Sergio Caletti, who made of his exile reflections and intellectual program and an ethic of academic work that knew how to accommodate and encourage our most audacious desires. Another great teachers and inspirers, Argentinian teachers and inspirers, such as Horacio González, who left us this year, the great Susana Murillo, my dear Emilio de Ipola, among many others, such as Nicolás Casullo, Eduardo Gruner, Leonardo Fuchs, Leon Rosichner, Toto Smukler. Well, but for a book like this to be published, it is also necessary to have accomplices and comrades who, not being from this land, can see the world with generous eyes. Without the friendship and complicity of you, Warren, Vittorio, and Agon, your readings, your support, and even your insistence, in Agon's case, I would not have been able to cross the infinite material barriers. There were also other complices, surely, such as Frankie Mays and Scarlett Funes from Roman and Littlefield, and my beautiful family and my partner, Martin, and especially thousands of students who come every year and marvel themselves at the beautiful and lucid prose of Marx, Freud, Lacan, Althusser, and defy for a while the presentism, the banality, the despair, the catastrophism, all of them, and all of you, my friends, are part of this body of which this book would like to be a singular fragment. And for theories, a book of theory. It is, for me, a tribute to theoretical production and an act of love for what is true. And because, it is because it is a book of theory that it is a book that it wants to deeply touch political thinking and political practice, a call to the humility of theory. It has to do with the reason why I started reading Althusser years ago, because I think that the gaps of our theoretical canon in the critical field nowadays has to do something with that. This book wants to be an effort to point out a forced silence due to extra theoretical, ideological, political issues, which leave marks, gaps in contencies in our theoretical frameworks. The silence of the problematic, of Althusserian problematic, a problematic that came raised and overflows his writings, of course, because it is a collective problematic involving the finest writing and thought of Etienne Balibar and Michel Pechet, as Warren pointed out, and Pierre Macheret, among few others. I think that this silence indicates the place of our theoretical impotence, the fragility of the conjunction between theory and politics, and it is that it is a trace of an ideological defeat, I would say, that we have not been able to think with humility and generosity. It is one of the bridges broken, to put it in an image, in Sergio Caletti's image, this image of broken bridges at the end of the 70s. It is a sort of hermeneutic abyss, or abyssum, that the questions and the polemic that for theory proposes are stretched. The challenge is, in any case, to resist making of this revisiting a history of ideas, as Agon has said. The bet is that this theory moves us in our present as an available genealogy, as an inheritance or a specter, perhaps. I would like to add something about Warren's comment. I was wondering what it means to decolonize theory today. It's very difficult for me answering that question, speaking in English, you know. that would be our next bet, perhaps. But I think that Althusser offers us a clue to avoid taking this bet in a key that yields to relativism, multiculturalism, or anti-intellectual temptations. I think that Althusser's writing, like that of any great master, offers itself to be crossed out. There is a profoundly generous gesture of strong humility there. Althusser, the great theoreticist, is a call, as I can see it, is a call to the humility of theory. And what to say about reformism? That first chapter was written with a great fear, I must say, a fear of being misunderstood, or perhaps also with a bit of recklessness. But it has to do with the deep need that I hear in many comrades and friends, the need to abandon what has become a wooden language, a fearful language. It is necessary to take risks and make mistakes, even if that does not even if that cost us our names or force us to lose our fear of ridicule. And finally, what I want to say is that in my understanding of the materialistic practice of theory, no one thinks alone, and there is no thought without friendship. And I'm very grateful and very happy that this Zoom is full of friends today. And I'm grateful because I think and I believe perhaps we are doing something here, and not only here, but with many conferences and encounters and conversations and mutual readings. Perhaps it only remains for me to say that I hope we can meet in April 2022 in Buenos Aires to do philosophy, to discuss politics, and of course to dance and embrace each other as we materialists do. So thank you, and well, perhaps we can have a little conversation. I know it is Saturday and it is the nap hour here in Buenos Aires, but well, thank you, and that's all for me.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have one question. Natalia, can you see the chat? So there's one question by Dhruv Jain. Okay. Within this discussion about the decolonization and Althusser, I was wondering what is the status of Pauline Huntonji's Althusserian interpretation of ethno-philosophy in this post-colonial Althusserianism? Okay, Natalia, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I haven't read anything about, sorry, Drav, but you can send me the title of the book. And
yeah, is anyone,
occasion.
any of the speakers have something to say about? I'm not familiar with that either, so I can't really comment on it. Is Dhruv Jain here?
Dhruv, you must tell us.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, well, can you say
Yeah.
something about that? Yeah.
So Pauline Huntonji was one of Althusser's African students. He attended his seminars. If people look at the full edition of the Lacan lecture, of Lacan's lectures from the early 60s, you could actually find reference to a P. Huntonji, so he was attending those seminars along with the rest of the Cahiers group. And he wrote a book called African Philosophy, which was basically an Althusserian Althusserian critique of what was considered ethno-philosophy, this attempt to create a non-European, non-Cartesian philosophy within the interstices of African culture, of different African cultures like Bantu philosophy. And he basically argued against that position, arguing that one actually had to maintain a kind of Althusserian stridence, Althusserian definition of science and philosophy in juxtaposition to what they were proposing. And that, anyways, I don't want to go, this is Natalia's book launch, but I thought maybe people would be interested in that.
Well, that's something to look into for all of us. Any other questions or concerns? Nothing?
I will ask my question from the first book launch, which we did for Natalia's book at Rethinking Marxism and at Historical Materialism, and which was there was one reception of Althusser in the 1970s vis-a-vis Ernesto Laclau, and that sort of intervention of Althusser in the 1970s and then break from Althusser in the 1980s, with hegemony and socialist strategy and the direction he went in afterwards. I was wondering, how does Laclau work in reorienting this current Althusserian movement in Latin America? Is it against him? Is it with him? Is it half and half? How does Laclau's Althusserianism play into your framework?
Natalia?
Should I answer? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question. Perhaps Martina and Ricardo, that are my colleagues and friends, which have studied a lot about Laclau, may add something. But I would say that there's a kind of paradoxical movement with Laclau's studies. Laclau's theory, especially hegemony and socialist strategy, had the benefit that reintroduce Althusser's ideas to 90s reading scholars that were interested in discourse theory and that smelled something about a kind of disconnection between discourse theory and political theory. There was a kind of repoliticization of discourse theory with the reading of Laclau for many of us. But of course, the other way around, the problem with Laclau is that he, in my point of view, he impoverishes the concept of overdetermination, and he make this step out from ideology concept through and replace it with discourse, and so he has the problem that he can't he can't see in which way, when he talks about politics, he's talking about struggle in ideology, ideological struggle. So he and the other question is perhaps that this concept of discourse builds a kind of new metaphysics, because it becomes an hypertrophy, an abstract figure that pretends to replace the concept of historical totality. So you have many times there, many problems there. The other problem is the temporality. It is also an impoverishment of multiple temporality. Many well, I can't say that in English. Postfundationalist, is that? Postfundationalist philosophies have this problem that embrace the concept of contingency, but can think about something that is very interesting in Althusser's last writings. That is the concept of a determinate contingency, a concept of, I think that aleatory materialism builds this paradoxical relation that it was, I won't cheat there, I think it was in the concept of overdetermination and in the early writings of contradiction and overdetermination, but he read it in the 90s and after. Well, you can make a complex thought about contingency that many of the post-structuralist writers think that have surpassed, but perhaps they are below these ideas.
Okay, Natalia, we have a couple of other questions. Let's see. First, Craig Schammel. Hold on 1 second. I would like to hear Natalia speak a bit about her theoretical, practical understanding of temporality in relation to history and the science of history and Althusser. He hasn't read For Theory yet, and he apologizes. That's it.
Well, we need many hours to do that. I don't know what to say. I would say only that there are many great books about that, especially written by Vittorio's group. But I truly think that there's a question with the concept of time and a theory of multiple temporality and a theory of history hidden there in the many writings of Althusser that has to be developed and think of, and I think that it is a better way to revisit Althusser today, searching there the concept of time. We would find many new ideas, just to continue thinking and to continue performing critical thinking.
Okay, the next question from Stefano Pipa. One of the things that I very much liked about the book is the recuperation of Pécheur. I would be interested to know more about Natalia's relationship with Pécheur's thought, and in particular, I would like to know her thoughts on a possible use of the notion of interdiscourse against certain non-Althusserian reconceptualizations of ideology.
Well, I don't know if I understand what these non-Althusserian reconceptualizations of ideology are, Stefano. My relation with Pécheur, well, I don't know. We've been reading Pécheur in our group in Buenos Aires University with my colleagues and friends, with Ricardo Terribles that is there, and Carolina Rey, and Martina. Mara Glossman is also there, which is a great linguistic researcher on Pécheur's works. My actual interest in Pécheur is mainly political. I think that there is not only a great discourse theory there, a theory of discourse that while the concept of interdiscourse is very useful and interesting to discuss with especially with the French school of discourse analysis, but also because it stays, let's say, it stays close to Marxism, not just close, but it gives us the way to reintroduce theory discourse in the field of Marxist thought. I would say like that. The relation between discursive formation and social formation, the relation between discourse temporality and historical plural temporality are some of the questions that have been abandoned in discourse analysis. So I think that there's a good way to perhaps rebuild these bridges that had been cut between one of the very interesting theories about discourse from the 80s, the 90s, and after, but with a question about historical totality, with a question about struggle, class struggle, and with a question about unconscious. I think that the most interesting part of Fecha thinking is that he insists in this idea of discursive formation as a contradictory and unity. And this idea of contradictory unity that leads us to think the connections between the concept of discourse and the concept of ideology has a lot to do with class struggle and unconscious theory. So there is there you can have debates with Foucaultian school and French discourses school, and well, I think that there is much to do there also. And sorry because of my terrible English, but it's very difficult for me to think and to speak in English at the same time.
Well, you'll have another chance because we have a question from Panagiotis. My question would be about theoretical anti-humanism and why it is still a necessary starting point of any radical politics, given the tendency of most of contemporary radical political discourse to focus on notions that are close to a certain version of theoretical humanism. For example, the constant evocation of a conception of the human species or varieties of such evocations.
Well, thank you, Panagiotis. It's a great honor to have you here. I agree that there's a big question there with humanism. I don't know if I agree with myself about what to do with humanism, if it is the time to make a step forward out from humanism. But I think that there are many, but surely theoretical humanism, it's a kind of, put many limits to our materialist thinking, especially in a sort of dichotomic scheme that I can, I'm reading in many very new reflections and theories that can be thought about a kind of counterposition between life and techniques. I think that many developments, critical developments, are nowadays trapped in this dichotomy. And I found a great and very polemic group of ideas in Althusser's Sur la reproduction, when he pointed out near the May 68 this problem in the terms of politicism, deviation, or economicist deviation of Marxism. And I think that the action of the primacy of social relation over productive forces, the social relations, productive relation over productive productive forces, it's a very rigorous clue to reorganize our discussions today, a great criteria of demarcation, and we can perhaps rebuild this kind of recommencement of Marxism with this idea. So I would say that the problem with theoretical humanism today is that one. It's a very poor scheme, dichotomical scheme between life and techniques. Well, there are many other concepts that are involved there, but I would say that that is the humanist theoretical problem today.
Okay, we have another question. Is that okay, Natalia? I don't want to, okay. Yep. Okay, by Kamran Baradaran, I'm probably not saying it right, but Natalia writes in page 6 of For Theory, quote, because there is currently no safeguard against the melancholy of defeat, it is necessary to insist on the need to understand the tendencies of late capitalism precisely as tendencies of a conjuncture, that is, as contradictory processes that give shape to the complex fabric of social reality in a precarious state of regular but unguaranteed duration, unquote. That's a quote from you. As she elaborates later in the book, Althusserian theory looked toward these specific materialist dialectics with the guide of the category of overdetermination. From your point of view, in an Althusserian way, how does overcoming the defeats of the past, especially in the age of so-called techno-feudalism, how can it be non-reductionist and based on a truly radical materialism?
Well, hello, Cameron. Happy that you're here. It's a very difficult question. I don't know if we can think something there, but I would say that what I wanted to state in the book is that many of our current theories have come very abstract, and these sort of abstractions can be thought of as an impoverishment of the concept of overdetermination. The concept of power or some concepts of biopolitical theory, the concept of discourse, the concept of hegemony are in many ways developed in a very abstract way, misconsidering the complexity of the conjecture, misconsidering the plural temporality of a conjecture, and I find also this problem in many feminist theories, in many post-colonial theories. What I said some seconds ago about politicist deviation or economicist deviation can be thought of as impoverishments of the concept of overdetermination. The great difficulty we have is to think of at the same time the universal and the singular, the universal and the case, and well, I don't think that the solution depends only in voluntary work. It depends in a political transformation. Finally, this impoverishment of theory is an impoverishment of collective thinking, and we are very trapped in the material conditions of collective thinking, of collective intelligence today. So we're trying to do something, but I don't know how to no, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today. And we want everybody, let's give Natalia a big round of applause. Just silent, but very meaningful. And thank you so much for coming and contributing. And thank you, most of all, Natalia, for writing the book and talking about it and answering all these questions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Gracias.
Chao, gracias.
Bye-bye.
Gracias. Chao.
Chao, amigos.
Chao, chao.
Chao, gracias.
Tchau do Brasil.
Thank you, Warren, Vittorio.
That was wonderful. Thank you. So I want to ask you a question, not about your book, but is I mean, I have many questions about the book, but is the conference in April, is that going to be in person?